I am thrilled to tell you all about our fight for science in Louisiana and in Texas, where we've got a few problems coming up right now. And so I grew up in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and my home state is really addicted to creationism. Our first creationism law was thrown out in the Edwards versus Aguilar case back in 1987 by the U.S. Supreme Court, but we didn't learn a lesson. And in 2008, we passed the Louisiana Science Education Act. It's a really clever law. It allows supplemental materials to be brought into Louisiana science classrooms to critique evolution. And that's because evolution is a controversial theory, controversial to politicians, not to scientists, but because it's controversial to Louisiana politicians, we can bring these supplemental materials into science classrooms. And there's really no limit on what can be used in the classroom, because the only way they could craft this law so that creationism was allowed in, they have to allow anything. And so theoretically, you could bring in astrology or alchemy or just nonsense, complete nonsense, not even based on anything, just paper with random words on it, in science class, and teach it as a critique of something and be legal. But the real point of the law was for creationism. And we know that because the legislative sponsor of this law, Senator Ben Nevers, said straight out, he was asked about the law, and he said, this is for having creation taught wherever Darwin's theory was taught. Or Governor Bobby Jindal, a governor who signed the law, he was asked in April. They asked him, well, what do you think about creationism in public schools? And he said, we have this law that allows, if a school board allows it, to teach creationism, to teach intelligent design in public school science classrooms. And then he went on to ask, what are we afraid of? So this is a new strategy in creationism these days, is the stealth legislation to sort of teach the controversy, to open up science to critiques to be brought into the classroom. And that's because they're no longer allowed to teach creationism. That was thrown out in the Edwards case in Louisiana. And intelligent design in 2005 was also ruled unconstitutional in Kitzmiller versus Dover. And that case was not a U.S. Supreme Court case, but it's essentially set precedent that intelligent design is creationism. It's no longer science. It's not science and can't go into a science classroom. So creationists no longer use these. Now they go for just a more ambiguous teach the controversy, and they say it's about promoting critical thinking. And we all think critical thinking is good. Everyone should learn how to think critically, but that's the point of science class. You don't bring a law from the legislature in there to make science classes teach critical thinking. If you're teaching the scientific method and teaching the science, students are going to learn how to think critically. The only reason for a law is to sneak non-science like creationism or also climate change denial, because this law also targets that, to sneak that into a classroom. And that really it will confuse students about the scientific method and the nature of science, because the way science works is just our best explanation for the natural world. We test things, we repeat those tests, and there are specific conditions that would prove, if we test our explanation and it came up with certain conditions, we'd be wrong, we'd have to go back to the drawing board and start over. Creationism meets none of those things. So if you confuse students about that and say, well, the scientific method applies, except when it applies to evolution. And so it no longer applies here. Well, what does a student think when you tell them that? Do they go into physics class and say, hey, the scientific method doesn't work in biology, doesn't work in physics. We don't have to test things. Like, what do you do when you confuse students about the scientific method? It will harm them in all their future scientific endeavors. And so the Louisiana Science Education Act is law in my state. It's been used to allow school boards to say we want to teach creationism in the science class. We've had school boards say the law is for critical thinking and creationism. They said we didn't want a lawsuit, but someone needs to stand up for Jesus and test this and use it to teach creationism. And so we've had that happen. Originally, when the law was passed, it went to our State Board of Education to implement it. The State Board originally prohibited creationism, and that set the creationists off. They went ballistic and got those prohibitions scrapped. So right now, there's really no protection on what's taught in this law, and we've seen some of the supplemental materials that have been suggested. They say that the Cambrian explosion disproves evolution, that there are no transitional fossils. Some of the more extreme ones suggest using materials from Answers in Genesis, which is the Creation Museum, and from the Institute for Creation Research. And so the key thing, this is what's happening in Louisiana, but it's not a Louisiana problem. And I think many of you all might know that because right down the street from here is the Texas Education Agency. And I was there about a month ago for the Texas textbook adoptions. And we've got a little problem. There are members of the State Board of Education, including the board chairwoman, Barbara Cargill, who are creationists. And back when the science curriculum standards were adopted a few years ago, they managed to compromise those. And so now Texas curriculum requires all sides of theories to be taught. And they have various little ways for creationists to weasel in. Sort of the same in Louisiana. We want all sides of evolution taught. We have critiques of the theory, and everything has to be, they analyzed, evaluated, and critiqued is the phrase they use. In Texas, that is sort of the equivalent to Louisiana's law, where creationism can be snuck in like that. And so those standards exist, and they're already compromising Texas education. Y'all may remember in 2012, when Governor Perry got asked about creationism, he said, "We teach it in Texas." He had his spokeswoman send the media afterwards, the reason he says we teach it in Texas is because of these curriculum standards allow that. And the worst part about this is textbooks adopted in Texas have to meet these curriculum standards. And so when it came up to the state board, they appointed expert reviewers, are what they're called. And these people are supposed to go through the books and say, what is right and wrong in the books? Is there a spelling error here? Did they miswrite something here? And it's just an extra group to check over and send critiques to the publishers to make sure it's all perfect. So normally when you do that, it's great. You have experts go look through the books and catch any small errors that might have been made. But when it's in Texas, the Creationist State Board appointed creationist reviewers who have said things like, the creation model based on biblical principles should be included in all these biology books. And because of that, and some of these reviewers, by the way, are fellows for the Discovery Institute, who is a national creationist think tank, or are part of the Creation Hall of Fame. So these are the people who were appointed by members of the state board to review biology textbooks. And many of them are reviewing the evolution section specifically with no counterpoint of a real scientist to sort of rebut them and say, no, that's wrong. And so what they did is they sent off these reviews. They gave the Texas textbook publishers low reviews because they didn't teach the creation model based on biblical principles, which makes it a lot harder to sell these textbooks. The good news on that is that the textbook publishers didn't care and refused to budge and said, we're not revising our textbooks to include the creation model. And so right now, there are some textbooks that haven't been given full marks yet that teach evolution, and part of that could be because the reviewers are creationists. And so the next meeting of the state board comes up in November, and that will be the final vote on whether they adopt these textbooks. And we keep telling the state board members, and there's a lot of them on our side, by the way. The Texas Freedom Network, a wonderful organization, also based in Austin, held a rally before the first meeting, and there were state board members who came out and said things like, evolution is real, I don't need to say more. So we have a lot of support on our side, but we need to make sure this last meeting in November goes our way, and we adopt good science textbooks that teach real science. And so I hope you all are there for that. But again, this isn't just a Louisiana problem, this isn't just a Texas problem. And I hear a lot about how, oh, this is just the South. We'll send all the stupid people to Louisiana and let them secede, and we don't have to worry about this. That's not really how this should work. I mean, we really need to fight back against bad science in our schools because it really harms kids. It harms people like my little sister. It harms all your brothers or sisters or kids. And we shouldn't just let it go. And this also happens all around the country. I mean, there's been creationism bills introduced in New Hampshire, Montana, Colorado, Florida, all around. So it's not just our problem. And it shouldn't be looked at like that. Despite that, we all have to fight it. And that's what I've been doing. And so when I was a senior in high school, I began a campaign to repeal Louisiana's creationism law. And it had passed when I was a sophomore, and I'd waited. I assumed an adult would stand up and fight this law because that was just how things worked. Adults dealt with it, and I assumed it would be gone before the end of the year. So I waited a year, and the law was still there. No one had touched it. No one seemed to care. So I waited another year, and the only news on that law was that local school boards were actually trying to use it to teach creationism. And at that point, I realized no adult was actually standing up and fighting this law, and that if someone was going to do it, it had to be me. And so I began to launch a repeal. And the first step for me was to find a mentor, Dr. Barbara Forrest, who I've been working with for years now. She happened to be one of the foremost experts on creationism in the country, was one of the expert witnesses at the Kitzmiller trial, which invalidated intelligent design, and happened to live about 25 minutes down the road in Louisiana from me. And so I started working with her, and I said, hey, will you help me repeal this law? And she said, well, we have no chance. The state legislature is overwhelmingly opposed, but we tried it anyway. And the next step for us was to find someone who had the courage to repeal the law. And there's always been good news and bad news on that. So the bad news is that when the Louisiana Science Education Act passed, there were only 3 legislators in the entire state opposed to it, 3 in the state House and none in our Senate, and the rest of the legislature voted overwhelmingly for the creationism law. And so at least we knew who to go to, who had the courage to stand up against the law. And one of those people was Senator Karen Carter Peterson, who she had been in the House when the law passed and now was a senator. And so I got a meeting with her. I started explaining, we had started building support. We had scientists on board. We had science organizations. I started explaining why the law was bad, and she just stopped me and cut me off and said, "You don't have to tell me, when do we get started?" And we don't have a video here, but y'all should go. There's a few YouTube videos of her. I'll sort of run through what happened in the Senate hearings later, but you should go watch the video because she's amazing. And there's one point where she smacks down one of our other legislators for calling scientists people with little letters behind their names. And she didn't really like hearing from. She was tired of listening to people with little letters behind their names. So Senator Peterson reminded her exactly of who these people with little letters were. And so we built the support. We had 40 Nobel laureates on board with us. We had a bill to repeal this law. We had major science organizations. We had tens of thousands of clergy members, tens of thousands of people who signed petitions. We had the New Orleans City Council voted unanimously to repeal this law. And we really had built a coalition of everyone but Louisiana politicians. And so we went into the legislature that first year to try and repeal the Louisiana Science Education Act. And we lost 5-1 because senators like the one mentioned earlier, Senator Julie Quinn, they really didn't want to hear from people who had little letters behind their names telling them what to do about science policy. And the important letters were things like JD and how they could weasel around and protect creationism in the classroom. And so that was our first year. And we came out of that, and everyone said, well, you lost. You got destroyed. Don't bother next year. We know what the result is going to be. And we didn't listen. And so we came back the next year, and we lost 2-1 in that hearing. So it was an improvement. 4 legislators who had voted against us the year before, or 3 legislators, were unwilling to vote again and vote against us. And something I learned in the Louisiana legislature, there's always an internet celebrity who gets made every time we're there. And so the first year I mentioned the little letters one. The next year was someone who got in an argument with a science teacher about whether evolution could be proved. And she started explaining Richard Lenski's experiment with E. coli bacteria, where he's been freezing E. coli bacteria as they've sort of mutated over time. And so you can go back and compare all the different mutations as they've changed. And she was explaining this experiment to them, and he goes, does it evolve into a person? Because that's evolution. And so 350,000 YouTube views later and a few thousand angry phone calls, he was rather upset about. But I'm sorry, I mean, evolution doesn't work like that. And it would have helped if he'd actually learned it in a science class, which is why we're trying to repeal this law. And so that was the second year. And this last spring, we tried again for a third time, and we lost again in our Senate Education Committee. We improved for the third time. We lost 3-2 this year, which is more votes than we've ever had against or on our side. And we're making slow progress. But we had a new senator who decided to make a fool of himself, and this was Senator Elbert Guillory. And he really illustrated why the law wasn't science. And he had this experience. He went to a witch doctor, and this doctor, he wore no shirt, wore no shoes, he was semi-clothed in the dusty spot. He was shaking some bones. And this man told him lots of things about his history. And Senator Guillory really would not want to keep that science out of Louisiana science classrooms because he learned very valuable things from the witch doctor. And so it really made the point. It's like all the Christian fundamentalists in the Louisiana legislature should listen to that and say, this law allows witch doctors in the classroom? We don't like that. And really, maybe that's why we should keep all religion out of science classes, because it's not science. And so we've tried 3 times now, and we've been unsuccessful all 3. And it's not an easy fight. And we've really learned that. And every year we finish and there's an editorial in the newspaper. One of the newspaper's opinion writers says, well, look, they lost again. Clearly they're not going to win. They should just wait until everyone in the Louisiana legislature retires so that there's a whole new legislature. And that's when they'll change this. And they shouldn't bother trying until things change in Louisiana. Or you could do the same thing in Texas. We shouldn't bother fighting in Texas until Don McElroy's dead and Barbara Cargill's retired. And we shouldn't bother fighting the creationists. But we don't do things just because they're easy and we expect to win the first time. And my favorite quote of all time comes from President John F. Kennedy, who, when he launched the space race, really illustrated why we not only do we do science, why we just do things that are hard in general. So we choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do other things, not because they're easy, but because they're hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills, because that challenge is one we are willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one which we intend to win. It really says it. We don't do these things just because they're easy and we expect to win on our first try. And we don't do science because it's easy and we expect it to all come out right on its first try. And we really have to keep fighting this, because there are real problems we face that it takes a scientifically literate community to solve. If we don't teach kids that climate change is real, then as our climate changes, because it's happening, we won't have scientists prepared to deal with that and prepared to help us. If we teach kids that evolution isn't real, every time we give someone antibiotics, it helps bacteria evolve so that those antibiotics won't be as effective. And if we teach kids that evolution isn't real and nothing's evolving, then we're going to have a huge problem with antibiotic-resistant bacteria. And so if we don't teach kids that, we're going to have problems. If we don't teach kids science, we're going to stop a future generation of scientists who can really invent the things we need to survive. And that's only half the problem, is what's being taught. The other half is what's happening to science funding right now. And in the last year, they've cut $80 billion from the budget for research and development over the next 10 years. And that is absolutely devastating. It's the only word for it. Right now, 20% of American scientists have said they're considering leaving the country because of the recent budget cuts. And if you're a scientist, if you're doing scientific research, it doesn't matter who you are or how brilliant you are. The age you're likely to receive a research grant is 44 years old. Since these cuts, it's raised 10 years. It used to be 34, which was already old. Like if you're going to work 15 years or 12 years, sorry about not to offend anyone who's 35 years old, I'm calling them old, but you're already going to be working 12, 15 years out of your bachelor's degree in research before you get your first grant, which is insane. And for it to be another 10 years added onto that is absolutely absurd. And these cuts are also coming in a decade where there hasn't been much change in science funding. So this isn't like we've been growing, we sort of dropped back down a little bit. We've been pretty stagnant, and then we just cut a major portion of it. So it's really stupid. I mean, it harms us from discovering the things we need to discover to keep growing as a society, to keep increasing our standard of living. Because that's the thing, science benefits us when we do it, and the things we discover. I like the iPad I have. I like speaking to Mike. I like taking medicine. I just took antibiotics this last week for a sinus infection. I'm very happy that all those things exist. But if we don't have science, if we don't do scientific research, we won't discover anything new. So that's one issue. And the other issue is you hear a lot of people talk about, well, we can't pay for scientific research because we have this huge deficit. And deficit's a long-term problem that can be solved over many years. We don't have to pay the debt right now. We can grow out of it and we can pay it off over time. And so the easiest way to do that is to make smart investments. And so when you start a company, you take out a loan, you go into debt because you expect you'll pay it off over time as you make money. Same thing with science. When you invest in scientific research, you expect that it will pay itself off over time. And so the best example is the Human Genome Project, where they put about $14.5 billion into it and generated $60 billion in tax revenue. So the government earned 400% on their investment, just in increased tax revenue from the research. And then the U.S. economy in total gained about $1 trillion from that research. So it pays itself off many times over. If I could go into debt to make that kind of return, I would gladly take the debt and the interest to make that kind of return, because it's far more than anything we ever pay. So the smart decision is always to invest in science, because it's a smart investment that will have huge return over the long term. And it has a huge return in just the benefits to humanity and what we discover, and it makes money. So the whole argument that we have too much debt to invest in science is really silly to me. And these are the big problems we're facing. We're not teaching kids science, and even if we were to teach them science, when they get out of school, they won't be able to use it because there's no money to do research. And so this is what we need to change. And that's what I've been calling the second giant leap. The first one was when we went to the moon, when we were teaching kids science, when we were funding science, and we had a huge leap for humankind. And then that's changed. Since the space race, the religious rights come back, we've been cutting science funding, and we need to turn that around. And so that's what I'm fighting for. I hope you all will join me in that, and I am happy to answer any questions y'all might have about Louisiana, Texas, how you can get involved in fighting over the textbooks right now, and anything else you might want to know. Yeah. So the question is, where is the connection between evolution denial and climate change denial? And so initially, there wasn't one. But what happened is the creationists would craft these laws that targeted evolution specifically and said, we don't want to teach evolution. And part of the court's rulings were that, well, they were targeting one version of science. Why do we need to think about, why does evolution need critical thinking but no other science does? Because evolution is one of the strongest sciences. And so why is this targeted? And they came out and said, well, it's a religious motive, and that's the issue. Is this helps reveal that there's a religious motive behind challenging evolution. And so after those rulings, the creationists came back and said, well, a lot of us also don't like climate change, and we also don't like human cloning, and we don't like the origin of life, and whatever else that they didn't like. And so they've added those to all their bills. And after that happened, the climate change deniers, which are more of the oil and gas companies, saw that and said, hey, that's a great strategy. And so now what you're seeing is climate change groups like denier groups like the Heartland Institute have taken the creationist model and are also, for the first time ever, we've seen a bill introduced that didn't just target, it did not target evolution, it targeted climate change only, which is fairly unique, and that was in Kansas. And so they've sort of joined together as they've realized we both deny science, we both follow a similar strategy, and this is how we break into the schools. And that's sort of, it's a marriage of convenience there. Because you also do see, for example, some evangelicals who don't believe in evolution but are very strongly supportive of climate science. And so you make the alliances you need. They won't help you on evolution, but if they'll help you fight the climate deniers, you work with them on that cause. And it's not necessarily a full overlap. How long are you going to keep fighting this until we just win? That depends if there's ever a real way to win. And when it comes to at least the evolution, sort of the policy in high schools, it's really just a game of whack-a-mole. They keep introducing bills, and you have to kill it every time they introduce it. And so each year we see 10 to 15 bills around the country. Louisiana doesn't have them anymore because we already passed ours, but you'll see Florida, sometimes Texas, Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, Kansas, Kentucky, Oklahoma usually has 2 every year, and so you have to kill those. And then you try and fight to repeal the bills that have been passed. So Louisiana's passed a bill, and Tennessee passed a copycat bill. And that's sort of the never-ending fight because all it takes is one legislator to introduce a new bill. And so the best we can really hope is that one day the polling on evolution changes and you're less likely to find people to introduce those bills. But right now, actually I should have mentioned these earlier, but according to the last Gallup poll, 44% of Americans believe the earth was formed in the last 10,000 years. And I will say that may partially be because of bad methodology, and I don't think that number is actually that high. There was actually a YouGov poll recently that put that number at 36%, which is still fairly absurd, but it's not 44%. But Gallup, for a very long time, it's been fairly consistent between about 40 and 48% and just fluctuates between that and hasn't changed. And so if Gallup's right, then that's a number, if either poll is right, but especially Gallup, those are numbers that have to change. And we have to start making headway into convincing people to believe in evolution. The other really scary number, which may actually be easier to change, is that right now 60% of American biology teachers do not teach evolution properly or at all because they don't believe in it or they don't understand it and don't have the requisite because it's the high school gym teacher who's been assigned to biology and doesn't know evolution, and so he just can't teach it. And so 60% of teachers do that. On top of that, another 13% of teachers teach creationism outright in their classrooms, and these are public school teachers. So that leaves only 27% of teachers who are teaching evolution fully and properly. And that's the number that needs to change even more, because until we can change that, and you'll have a generation of Texas and Louisiana and American politicians who've been educated where they don't know evolution and then say silly things like E. coli turned to people. And y'all should all go watch those videos because they're just amazing. I will occasionally go back and just look at some of the crazy stuff our legislators have said. And also, here's some good news on the Texas textbook fight, actually. There's another video you should watch. It's a video of Don McElroy, the former board president of the Texas State Board of Education. And he actually endorsed, he's a staunch creationist, but he endorsed Texas's biology textbooks because he thinks that evolution is weak on its own, and therefore when you teach evolution, kids will know it's false. So he was in support of books that taught evolution. And he endorsed them with a strike the final blow to evolution, support the Bible, and adopt these books. You know what? It's a little cuckoo. It makes no sense. But he endorsed the textbooks that we want, and we've had a lot of good scientists say they're good science textbooks. So we have the top creationist, and we have all the scientists on board with the science textbooks. So, we may have a good chance of adopting them.
How do we get involved providing the textbooks?
So I'm fairly certain the date. I'm cautious because I might be wrong on this, but go to the Texas Education Agency. There'll be a public meeting on the week of November 18th. I think it's November 18th, but I'm not entirely sure if the date has been set yet. The easy way to find this out, though, is to follow the Texas Freedom Network, which is a great organization. They fight all sorts of religious right and civil liberties abuses. And they are organizing all the stuff on the ground here. And so if you go look at tfn.org is their website, or follow them on Facebook or Twitter, there'll be all the information that's needed to go join in. And so what you can do is you can go sign up to speak at the hearing, and you get 2 minutes to tell the state board members that science is real and they should adopt the books. And it helps just have, the more people we have out there on our side, the better, because if the creationists bring out 10 people and we bring out 100, then it's going to look like there's a lot more voters on our side. And so that's sort of the simple way it works. And it's a bit of a complicated process to sign up. The Texas Freedom Network has a form available where you can just email it in, but it basically, they fax it for you, and the state board's made it so it's hard for the public to actually comment, and you have to actually fax a form in if you don't do it through the Texas Freedom Network. But that's more reason just to follow TFN and see what they're doing, because they're wonderful.
So what's the end game goal for these creationists?
The end game for them, to be honest, is to overturn the Supreme Court rulings on creationism and intelligent design. Now, saying that, that's not realistic. They really don't have any chance to do that because it's all the rulings they've ever had on creationism they've lost. And the courts have given no indication they're ever going to change that. So while that's what they want, and while that's what they're trying to do, they're introducing legislation that one day could be tested in the courts to hopefully allow creationism to be taught all over. It's not a realistic possibility. And so when you say that, I don't actually know why they're doing this, because their end goal, it just seems like they're on a losing battle, that for all the people who believe in creationism, they keep losing ground every court ruling, everything they fight. And so I don't really understand what their thought process is behind this, but they believe it, and so they keep fighting it. So how does the household affect sort of evolution versus creationism in the classroom, and whether your parents are a creationist or believe in evolution, and how does that affect your schooling? And so there's a lot of parents who are creationists who will keep their kids in homeschool or keep their kids in private school, and where they'll get taught it. And there's not too much we can do about that, besides just hope one day they'll be exposed to the science and learn. Where we get involved with that is when it's school vouchers or some sort of public funding to a private school that teaches creationism. And so in Louisiana and in 9 states in DC, there's these programs that give public money to private schools that teach creationism, that teach the Loch Ness Monster is real, that dinosaurs were real, they were dragons that lived with humans and breathed fire out of their nose, that scientists are sinful men is my favorite school in Louisiana. There's another school that mandates in their handbook that creationism must be defended against traditional scientific theory, because no one likes traditional scientific theory in science class. And so these are private schools getting millions upon millions in public money. There's we found 300 overall across the country that we know are teaching creationism and receiving public money. There's probably a lot more who are smart enough not to put things like evolution is the way of the heathen on their website, or there's schools in Indiana that drive their kids across the border for field trips to the Creation Museum in Kentucky. And so there's probably a lot more schools in these programs that haven't put that on their website, but at least 300 receiving potentially with that many schools and that many students, hundreds of millions of dollars in public money every year. So we can fight that and try and get the public money out of those schools. But a normal private school, you can't touch. Now, when it's a public school and you've got a kid who's a creationist in a public school, and they come home one day and say, I got taught creationism, then their parent might call the principal and complain. And in certain school districts, that's enough for the principal to go to the teacher and say, stop teaching this, I don't want to get calls, I don't want to hear complaints. And sometimes the teacher does. That's a huge problem. Now, on the other hand, if you're in a school that teaches creationism, it's a public school, that's not allowed. And so the problem is a lot of kids, A, don't know that they shouldn't, that creationism is wrong, B, that they're opposed to being taught it, and C, even if they're opposed to being taught creationism, they know it's wrong, they don't know that they can really stand up against it. And even if they do, they don't know where to go. And lastly, in places in Louisiana where they're teaching creationism, you're going to face a lot of backlash locally, maybe even from your own parents. And so it's got to take a lot of courage to fight it. But if you're being taught creationism in a public school, or if you know anyone who's being taught creationism in a public school, they can fight it. They should call the ACLU. They should call the National Center for Science Education, who's an organization that really fights on the ground all this type of creationism legislation. Call me. You can find my email online if you know someone who has been taught creationism in a public school, and have them contact someone who's in these sort of civil liberties groups, because they'll know how to take action and prevent it from happening again. And so that's what the answer there is. If you believe evolution and you're in a school that's teaching you wrong, you can fight it. But on the other hand, creationist parents can really pressure schools in certain areas to not teach the science. Is this a uniquely American problem, or is this all around the world? And you can see creationism popping up everywhere around the world. I mean, there's been a few issues with science textbooks in Korea, for example. Turkey has huge problems with creationism. Even Britain, for example, Scotland has several unappointed education ministers from the clergy, and some of those ministers are creationists and putting creationism in the schools there. And so it's a problem you see pop up everywhere where there's creationists who want it taught in the schools. But it's fairly prevalent and fairly persistent in America in a way you don't seem to see everywhere else. And for better or worse, we've always been fighting the culture war very prominently. How do we keep good science in the classroom? How do we keep new, unique science that hasn't been out there for too long on the very cutting edges in the classroom without allowing sort of this whole critique? And because they do market it under the idea of, oh, this is new, you haven't put all the science in there, the books, the science is all out of date. And we hear that all the time. And so the key thing is just have the experts be the ones doing it. So you put together a panel of the best educators, the best scientists, and have them look through the books and say, this is right, this is new. And so what we got brought up this year is epigenetics was brought up at the Texas School Board. And they said, well, you don't have epigenetics in the books. And epigenetics is not creationism, it's another mechanism of evolution. But because it's new and fancy in science, they're using it as a wedge to say, well, if this is missing, even though it's not in the curriculum yet, if this is missing, then the textbooks should all be thrown out. And so you just have to make sure it's constant. Science keeps changing, keeps growing, keeps evolving. You keep updating your curriculum and adding the new science and constantly fighting the battles to keep the creationist out. And that's just sort of how you do is get the experts on board. Okay, so what organizations, what did you say again? Cognitive liberty. Okay, so for cognitive liberty. So the best organization on science education around is the National Center for Science Education. They've been around for about 30 years. They have all the resources you would ever need to really answer any question about creationism or any other religion, creationism or climate denial also, in the classroom. And they have the staff on the ground around the country to fight bad legislation. Other groups who are involved are Americans United for Separation of Church and State, and they fight broader separation of church and state issues, so school prayer, things like that, they're also involved with. The ACLU is also great and is always involved with these issues. And those are the biggest three organizations I work with. There's also usually a local organization. So in Texas, it's a Texas Freedom Network who's on the ground fighting for science. And another big issue they've been fighting right now is the Planned Parenthood battles. And so they're working on that if any of y'all are interested in that. In Louisiana, we have the Louisiana Coalition for Science, or there's Oklahomans for Science Education, Florida Citizens for Science. And so you see local groups like that, but the three up on the national level are Americans United, the National Center for Science Education, and the ACLU. Does the rise of digital textbooks make a difference in sort of the textbook adoptions and how much power states like Texas, with their large size, have in influencing the market? And so what I'd say is, no, because there hasn't been enough time yet, we don't exactly know how digital textbooks are going to affect everything, but it's a state-by-state balance. So in Texas, for example, the state board tends to lean creationist, and there's been problems in the past. And so the Texas Freedom Network, for example, its policy is to have the ability for the entire every district around the state to choose their own textbooks, because if the state board adopts bad textbooks, at least it'll have the ability to protect districts in Austin and Houston and Dallas who want to teach good science. And say if Lubbock wants to teach creationism, well, that sucks, but at least it's not statewide. Even if it's harming science textbooks around the country, at least there's some freedom to get good science for certain districts. And so that's the on-the-ground reality of that. And so it may help in that situation for digital textbooks to be out there so that school board can adopt good science. They have more freedom to adopt a digital textbook. On the other hand, we've seen the creationists say, well, we don't need textbooks anymore because there's digital updates and we don't want textbooks and we can just get everything online, and use that as an argument throughout the textbooks. Or in Louisiana, for example, we have a very different situation. Our legislature is more creationist than our state board. Our State Board of Education has actually been fairly pro-science and has adopted new science textbooks that all teach evolution. We've kept those. We've been fighting every year now to keep those science textbooks for the last 4 years, but we've won every time so far. And so those textbooks are good. And every school district in the state, if they want their textbooks funded by public money, have to use a textbook that teaches evolution. And so in that scenario, it might harm us because it's another wedge that you can drive in and say, well, we don't want a standardized textbook. We want to adopt these random digital textbooks that some of them are creationist. And some of y'all may have heard in 2011, Texas did sort of a supplemental textbook adoption for science. And this online creationist textbooks nearly got adopted as a science supplement. And so you could see something like that happen in another state. And so it's sort of up in the air how this all plays out as time goes on. But we'll see. I don't think it dramatically changes the game in terms of what's going on as much as just maybe what actions we take. The question was, we've been hearing a lot of sort of bad legislation. These are the bad politicians. I can make fun of this politician and that politician for the silly things they say, but what's sort of the good, positive, what's coming up that will get kids excited about science? And so that's something that I've been trying to help fix, because that really is the thing. I can make fun of Michelle Bachmann, for example, for saying that Nobel laureates support creationism, or Paul Brown, who called evolution a lie from the pit of hell. But we don't have that many politicians that I can stand up and say, not just that these people are bad and you shouldn't vote for them, but these people are good pro-science and you should vote for them. And so there's a few I'll talk about. Senator Bill Nelson, a former astronaut from Florida who's been behind a lot of the science funding stuff. He's great. Rush Holt in New Jersey is a science teacher. He's brilliant. And there's a few pro-science legislators. But the problem is there's really been, the atmosphere in Congress right now has just been so bad that I've been trying to get a science funding bill for almost a year now in Congress. And it's small progress, and I really want to see at least a bill to start to repeal the sequester budget cuts to science. That's sort of baby steps in my mind for what really needs to happen. We need to be funding gigantic, just doubling, tripling science funding, making science funding a mandatory part of our budget. That's really what needs to happen. But baby steps are sort of reversing the damage that's been done recently. And we don't have that yet. So I'd like to see it happen. I'm working to see it happen. It's going to take sort of a huge nationwide grassroots movement to make it happen. And so sort of the steps on the way to that are, for me, getting a nonprofit running, hiring organizers to get people involved in every state, getting people in every state to call their congressman and ask them to introduce a bill. And it's a slow progress, but it's what we're working on. And so that's the next steps. And we'll just cross our fingers it works, because I don't see any other option besides having it work. We really need new science funding. So this is sort of about how the scientific method works, and also, I guess, the balance of how for politics in America. And the first thing on that is science is really just, to stress again, it's the best explanation and model for the natural world. And so there's always an understanding that it can change and grow, and that's the point of science. And actually the most interesting part of the scientific method for me is expandability. So it's the idea that when you do science, you'll discover something, but once you discover that, there'll always be a new question to ask. You'll say, okay, so this is what we learned. Now, why does that work? And you can keep learning new things and more things every time you discover it, because there'll always, always, always be more to learn. And that really doesn't apply to things like creationism. I mean, on a simple level, it's God did it. There's no more questions. And so that's the problem there, and people don't seem to get that. And science is not a numbers game, to be honest. This isn't about who has the most scientists on their side. And it's always a sticky issue because that's not how science works. Science is this explanation tested and retested, and has it come out of peer review strongly and accepted, and no one's found flaws that they can tear apart. And science continually works by evolution has been around 150 years. And every single day, there's tons of scientists who test it and try and break it, because if you actually find out that evolution is wrong and there's a new status quo, which of course won't be creationism, it'll be sort of some expansion on the current theory. But if you were to be the scientist who did that, you'd get a Nobel Prize, everyone in the world would know your name, and it'd be amazing for you. And so scientists every day, biologists every day, are testing evolution. And it comes back strong every single day. It's stronger and stronger because all the evidence is backing it. So that's how science works. Having said that, the creationists like to do these things like make lists of people who descent from Darwin. And they've got a list of about 800 scientists, most of them not biologists, who, they've got mathematicians, astronomers, various other people who aren't really qualified in the field to talk about evolution. They don't have very many. They've got about 800 who've signed onto this. So they say that they descent from Darwin. And now the best response to this kind of game is that, again, it's not about list making. But if we are to make lists, we should go to the National Center for Science Education's list. And they didn't want to make a list because they said, well, we don't want to just collect 100,000. Why would we waste our time collecting all the scientists who accept evolution? That's the status quo. So instead, they made a list of people in honor of Stephen Gould, of scientists named Steve, or some variation of Steve, who accept evolution as a counter list. They're now approaching twice as many people as the descent from Darwin list, but only scientists who are named Steve. So that's about 1/100th of the American population. And so it comes out to, 200 times larger than the descent list if we just expand that out, which means that about 99.5% of scientists are in support of evolution by that measure. And so if we're going to make the list, this sort of illustrates how ridiculous their list is. On top of that, the Steve list has more biologists by far and has many more prominent scientists. So again, it's not about list making, but if lists are to be made, that's a good one to point out how ridiculous it is. I'm a history major, so what area of history I'm interested in? How does this affect my work? So I'm actually off a year right now at Rice to do activism for a year full time, but Rice doesn't have specialties with history, so I'm sort of a general history major. Having said that, I've taken a lot of Chinese history. I find that very interesting. And where does history major play a role in sort of this work? Really, for me, it illustrates the fact is I don't have to know. You know what? If you ask me a question about evolution, I may know it. I've learned a lot of basic biology from high school and also just in the course of the last 3 years doing this work, but I may not know it. But it's not really relevant if I know it or not, because that's not how science works. What I can do, though, is find an expert who can explain to me the biology, who can show me the peer-reviewed studies, and answer all the questions. And there's always, because you're not going to know everything. But the key thing is to find what the experts know, find what the peer review says, and that's the right answer. And that's sort of how I thought about it, is there's always an expert in any field that you can work with, and you can see who knows best, and have them help answer the questions. Why do we trust the experts in these fields? And so it's not that I go call one person and say, hey, what's the right answer? And then I say, because this scientist said so, it's right. It's because you go look and say, what does peer review say? What do all the studies? And do we have hundreds, do we have thousands of studies that point to this explanation, and we have all the experts say this explanation? Okay, and there's science organizations, for example, that the easy way, if you want to know about a certain scientific topic, go Google it with the name American Association for the Advancement of Science, and they'll have a statement on it that says, our 10 million members overwhelmingly agree on this. And that's a fairly good indicator of what's right or wrong, or at least what's right or wrong based on our current knowledge. And that's how you sort of avoid that trap of having one person say, well, this is right or wrong. So there's 2 points. Yes. So would there be any possible compromise? And the first point on that is On principle, no, because the separation of church and state clearly would separate religion from government, and public schools are government. And so creationism is religion. So to put it in there would break that. Because the first question is, well, what creation story do you teach? Should we teach the story of, should we teach about Brahma coming out of a lotus in science class? Or should we teach a Native American creation myth? Or should we teach about Allah in a science classroom? And when you get there, I mean, first, there's so many myths to teach. What do you teach? Secondly, if you're going to spend all your time in science class teaching creation myths from various different cultures, it wastes all the time to do science. And so why not just have that in a comparative religions class where it's appropriate? And so I think every school should have a comparative religions or a philosophy class, and you can learn about all the creation myths there, and that's a wonderful place. I mean, I took a philosophy class in high school, and you could talk about things like creationism, but it wasn't science, because science is simply an explanation of the natural world, and so that's what you put in that class. The second point, though, is theoretically, if a compromise could stop all this, would we do it? And if we could compromise, like whether or not on principle we say no, could we compromise with the Christian creationists and say, okay, you get a little thing in the appendix that says go learn about this later? The problem is the creationist thinking, there was something published after the Edwards ruling, which invalidated creationism, and they invented intelligent design. And they wrote this thing they called the wedge document. And the idea was to get a wedge into materialistic science. And so once they got anything in there, if they get a disclaimer on the textbook, if they get something in the appendix, if they get anything, that's their wedge into the science classroom. And then they can use that to get more and more and more in there. So even if we were willing to compromise, it wouldn't work because they're using it as a way to just get their toe in the door and subvert the rest of it. So what's to make sure teachers teach evolution fully is a question. And that is the problem. I said 60% teachers don't do that, and 13% go the exact opposite way. And that's really the way to do that is to educate teachers in evolution fully and really just to change public perception. And you have to do both at the same time. You have to make sure more students learn evolution, and you have to, while you're at it, you have to be fighting to make sure more students are allowed to learn evolution. And it's going to take generations probably, but it's the only thing we can do because right now the numbers aren't very good, and that's happening, and that's the reality. Why don't we have two systems separated, I guess is sort of the gist of that. And theoretically we do. I mean, people can homeschool their kids, but what's interesting is that doesn't necessarily mean, even if you're homeschooling your kid, you keep your hands off public education because it's all part of a broader culture war. And so, for example, this year at the hearing, we had about 20 kids show up on the other side from us. The thing is, not a single one of them went to public school, and they all testified in support of keeping Louisiana's creationism law. And we actually had a legislator go like, hey, what's the reason we have a bunch of homeschoolers testifying on law that revolves around public school? And they said, well, we want the public school kids to think critically like we do. But it doesn't, the point is, it's like, even with that system, you'll have the religious right, they still want to subvert public education. And so it doesn't seem enough to have creationism in their church and their homeschool. And the other answer is like, I can't really affect what you teach your kid in homeschool or in a private school, but I really wish you taught your kid evolution. And so, I guess the best we can do is hope they go to college or something one day and learn evolution. That's really the only thing we can do in that circumstance. But, under the laws, it's parents' right to teach their kids what they want in the privacy of their own home or send them to a private school. Right, so Rick Perry says they're teaching both. Based on curriculum. The problem is no one really knows what's being taught school by school anywhere besides the people in the school. So right now there are reports of actually a charter school program, Responsive Education Solutions, that uses creationist materials that came out, I think that news came out on Friday. And we don't exactly know what's being taught in all those classrooms. I went to the school that got highlighted. It was in Northwest Houston. I went there yesterday and drove out there, and they would not allow me to look at their curriculum. They put me to PR, and PR has, I've been asking them for their curriculum, and we'll see what they give me. That's sort of the best, thing. So we have a lead on, for example, a school teaching it, and charter schools essentially should follow the same rules as public schools when it comes to creationism. There's nothing special about, charters have more freedom in their curriculum because the state keeps its hands off on how it's developed in the best models, but they're basic accountability rules that they still have to follow. And so that's the difference between charters and voucher programs, for example. And so theoretically, we can do something about it whenever we discover the school's teaching it. But it's a teacher-by-teacher thing, a school-by-school thing, and unless you're in that classroom, it's very hard to know. So theoretically, you first go to your teacher, you ask them to teach science. If they don't do it, then you go to your principal. If your principal doesn't do it, you go to the school district and ask them. Now, having said that, you can go to all of those people and have all of them come back and say, well, we like creationism. And so at that point, or even before that point, because technically if a teacher teaches creationism, they're violating their contract. They've signed a contract with the state that says, I will teach science, and science is what's in their curriculum, which is evolution. And so even in a state where they've compromised the curriculum, what it does is allow a teacher to not immediately lose their job for teaching it, and it puts it on the state, rather than, like, it doesn't mean that creationism can be taught. It means that if you're punishing someone, the state gets punished. In Texas, let's say, if a teacher says, I'm just teaching both sides like the state requires me, then it's on the state. But creationism is altogether unconstitutional. So if it's being taught in schools, a student theoretically could immediately sue the state or sue the school or try and get the teacher fired for that, because the teacher's signed a contract with the state to teach science, no matter if the state's run by people who don't like science. And so that's the remedy. So if someone gets taught creationism, you call the ACLU and say, hey, I was taught creationism in the classroom. The ACLU will probably send a letter to the school saying, hey, you can't do this. If you continue doing this, we'll sue you. And if they continue doing it, then they'll sue the school or the school district. So that's sort of the model for how you fight it. I don't know the specific policies on that. I'm actually wondering how technically legal that is. Yeah, I don't know the specific policy on that, but I'd be sort of curious to know how that works out, because, for example, disclaimers, which the creationists like to put on the textbooks, they say things like, this textbook teaches evolution, be aware that evolution is only a theory. That stuff's been thrown out because, while it's technically true, evolution is only a theory. The point is to mislead people based on the public misunderstanding what theory means, which is, in common use, a theory is just a guess. In scientific use, it's about the strongest thing there is. And it's been tested and retested over and over and over until it's the best accepted explanation for the natural world. And so while they do these things, if it's meant to mislead students about it and sort of compromise the education, it's still unconstitutional. So I don't know the specific policies, but I'd be curious to see how it works. What's sort of the status of one nation under God and the Pledge of Allegiance? And so I think there was a court ruling on that, and I think the Supreme Court let it stay, but I haven't followed it very closely.
Oh, I was hoping it was removed, and then that way we if it does get removed, wouldn't that, I mean, like, so many people spoke up against that. How come no one's been speaking against creationism as hard?
People choose the battles they want to choose for some reason. I mean, I think the science fight is the most important fight around, but not everyone does, and that's the only thing I can say on that one. Some people choose other fights. It also comes from where people feel, if someone doesn't like to say, like, let's say the Pledge of Allegiance every morning, and feels personally offended by that, and they're not taught creationism, they might choose that fight. So that's sort of where that comes from. Yeah. I mean, it'd be nice to see more people. The biggest issue with the fight over science is that people don't really, it's something that has an effect over the next 20, 30, 40 years, and not immediately, in the same way that many other social issues. I mean, for example, if you are abused because if you're bullied because you're LGBT in your classroom, that has an immediate effect that you see right away. And so that's action we take, and you fight that right away, because it affects your life right now, right then. And it's a direct cause and effect that you can see. It's immediately painful. People don't look and say, well, in 20 years, if we don't teach kids science, we're going to be hurting a lot more. You don't look at that. You just say, well, why does America have no scientific research? And we didn't act right 30 years ago. And so that's the big issue, is someone will say, if someone will take action on another issue because it's affecting them right then and there, and they'll act right then. But but next thing is like, well, why should you skip class today to go to the State Board of Education hearing? It's like, I do that every day because I think it's that important, but not everyone does, because they say, well, someone's going to do it, and it's not. It's a long term. It's an issue that, no, I'm not being hurt right now personally because they're not teaching science. And so that's something we're trying to correct and make people more aware of the factors. And I mean, the only way to do that is sort of scare them and say, hey, look, for example, climate change is happening. If we don't teach our kids about climate change, I mean, I'm from New Orleans. Like, my city's gonna be underwater fairly shortly. I don't want that to happen. And so you do that and hope people take the message. What do you do about people who are, I mean, if I've criticized the homeschool kids for testifying against it, what about the people who are, say, homeschooled to testify, or who are testifying for the law? What about the kids who are homeschooled to testify against it? And so the first thing is, it is interesting. You normally see the public school kids on our side and the homeschool kids on their side overwhelmingly. But everyone, I mean, the thing is, everyone's allowed to comment publicly. It's your right as a citizen. And so they're perfectly within their rights to testify. That's what I'd say. But I would point out, again, I mean, it really applies to everyone. If you're not affected, it's worth noting, well, they're not personally affected. And so I was never taught creationism. I can admit that. And it makes someone who's taught creationism a little bit stronger of an advocate than I am, just in the way that I'm a public school kid, or I was a public school kid. I'm a stronger advocate than a homeschool kid is. On the other hand, if you connect a personal narrative to it, I was taught creationism in homeschool, and that's why it's wrong, and this is a creationism law, then suddenly it applies a little bit more. But that's person by person. The question is do you have a better right to speak against or for the law? So I'd say it helps, you are a better advocate. Your case is better the more you can relate to the issue at hand. That's just a general rule. And so if you don't know anything, if you don't know anything about the issue at hand, or you aren't involved with it, you're going to be a poorer advocate than if you're not. Again, it's everyone's right to speak. Some people speaking means less than others. So everyone, for example, I'd say on science funding, everyone has a direct interest in it, and everyone's probably equally, it's how well you make your case, equally affected by it. But it's still, if you make your case poorly, if you can't connect yourself to it, you're going to be less effective than everyone else. And that's really, it's about effectiveness. All right. Thank y'all so much.